Hi, my name is Chris Walsh. I am a senior program manager with the Human Freedom Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. And I'm pleased to be here with Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, who is the Bush Institute's Kelly and David Pfeil Fellow. And in her spare time is a professor in the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University. Nicole, thank you for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be in the conversation.
Well, as you know, and maybe as some in our audience don't know, is that earlier this year, you authored a new report called Choose Freedom, looking at revitalizing democracy and human rights in U.S. foreign policy. We've taken a kind of a road show across the country, going from places as far as Vermont to here in Texas to Florida, talking with all different types of people about this, including a lot of university students and young Americans. And I think during that time, we've experienced a lot of different and interesting viewpoints that they've expressed, including kind of I'll call it a crisis of confidence in democracy. And I certainly understand frustration from young Americans over how democracy is delivering for them. I think we've all been there at some point or another. Sometimes it's not efficient. But I'm particularly concerned about two things that I want to kind of get your reactions on. The first is about the pace of democracy. I think a lot of people are frustrated by that. I think they want democracy to be kind of Amazon Prime. You know, I have my grievance. I know what the solution is, and I want it within 2 days, and I want free shipping. But I fear that, you know, there's almost, if an acknowledgement is missing, that the pace of democracy is deliberate, especially when you factor in things like, you know, checks and balances on power and balancing minority interests with majority interests. And the other thing I think is related, the other concern I have is that when we're talking about these things, I wonder if there is some missing acknowledgement, again, that there are competing viewpoints in a democracy, that there are nuances and that not everyone might agree. And that too might affect the pace of democracy, especially when you factor in that government has to be responsive to all these different viewpoints. How would you respond?
Thanks, Chris. It's a great place to start the conversation. And I think it's important to understand where these views may be coming from young Americans, and to think about actually how many of those views point to the importance of democracy, actually. I do think there's a concern about the pace. I wish that democracy came as quickly as Amazon Prime, but the reality is the best thing about democracy is it does give a platform to bring a lot of voices together, and it ensures that those voices are heard. And what I hear so often, and I think the energy that comes from young Americans, is this desire for inclusion of voices. And because democracy commits to that inclusion of voices, because democracy provides platforms for civic engagement, for voter engagement, for writing to your congresspeople, because it includes those processes, it just takes time sometimes. I wish the change would come as quickly as possible, but if we're committed to including a lot of voices and we're committed to a process that allows that exchange of views, then we also have to give the space and the time for that to take place. I think it is also very hard, particularly in this very partisan time that we're in this country, to think about allowing space for other voices. There are many times where I hear from people, I feel so strongly about my views that I don't really want to leave space for others' views, or I don't really respect what the view is on the other side. And I think what we have to recognize, particularly for those of us who are so passionate about different views, issues like immigration or healthcare or foreign policy, in order for our view to have space to be heard and to be taken into the policy process, we have to leave space for diverse voices, even those that we don't agree with. And that's the important thing that we have to remember, is that democracy provides that space for radically divergent views, but what it also does, it guarantees that our view will have a space when we want to raise our voice as well.
Thank you. I know, Nicole, that especially in your work as a professor, you've talked about a disconnect between young Americans and the value of democracy as a system. Would you talk about a little bit more about what that looks like and why?
Absolutely. What I see among our young Americans is energy and passion and drive. When you look at who is behind so many of the social movements, whether it's environment or racial justice or Me Too, this is a demographic that is very committed to social justice, equality, and change. And when you talk about systems and structures, truthfully, it's just not very interesting. It's not what energizes anybody. But what we have to recognize is that all of that energy, all of that passion, all of that desire for change has to be structured into a system that makes that change sustainable and actually turns that energy into policy change, legal change. And that's where we see real systemic change. And ultimately, that's what's going to get us to the policy positions that we want. And so I think the challenge we have is really connecting all of that great energy and passion that we see in among young Americans who are behind so many great movements and saying, let's take that passion and energy and put it into a structure that's going to bring sustainable and long-term change and recognize the linkage between the two.
Now, Nicole, I think some people might be watching and wonder, if not democracy, if people are frustrated with democracy, particularly young Americans, then what governance system would they prefer if not democracy?
Right. I think when there's frustration about a governing system and there are complaints or challenges to the system, often the conversation is not about a different system. I will say there's a very small minority of people who are talking about socialism. I think it's a small minority in our country. And for those who really want to study what socialism looks like, they would find deep inherent flaws in that system and where we've seen that system in other parts of the world. But what I really think is that there's frustration with the pace, as you mentioned, that democracy is not delivering as fast. But it's not that there's necessarily a desire for a differing system. It's just that they want democracy to deliver. And so what I think we need to do is move that conversation away from a criticism of democracy and channel that into strengthening of democracy so it delivers how and at the pace that young Americans and all Americans, quite frankly, would like to see.
Now, not everyone views things through the democracy lens like we do in our work every day. So how would you connect democracy to the passions of young Americans?
Absolutely. The reality is, in every country, we have to have a governing system. The alternative to a governing system is anarchy, and to having absolutely no governing structure that restrains bad actors or holds anyone accountable for behavior. So we have to have a governing system in every country. And when we look around the world at the different options for governing systems, democracy is quite simply the best governing system that we have ever seen in global history. It has a built-in channel to channel all of those inclusive voices. Doesn't mean it always does it perfectly. And we're seeing how we're pushing to have more voices at the table, but there are options to have those voices at the table. There are structures for change. There are legal structures. There are courts that allow us to make the change in our society that we want to see. And there are mechanisms for accountability, and we simply don't see that in other governing systems. So as we look around the world and we say, which of these governing systems is the best, democracy is the one that, quite frankly, gives us the best options. If we look now at how many people are raising their voices, for example, about racial injustice in the United States, that is absolutely a deep, deep challenge that we have in our society. But I would challenge young people who are frustrated with that pace of change to look at other governing systems and say, where is it in the governing system of other countries that people could peacefully go to the street and criticize their government, criticize government actions, criticize unjust laws, and be able to go home at night and not be arrested and not have a limitation on their rights? It is in democracy, as imperfect as it is at times, it is in democracy that we can go to the streets to raise our voices. Next, in 2 months, we're going to have an election in our country. That's going to give us a great opportunity to raise our voices and use one of the structures, the systemic opportunities that we have to bring change. And we just don't see that anywhere else in the world that does not have a democracy, an opportunity to raise your voice in the streets, to vote, to communicate with your government, to read quality journalism where people are able to critique policies. That simply only exists in a democracy.
Now, last question, especially as we think about the importance of freedom and democracy and human rights in our foreign policy, like we did with Choose Freedom, when I think about these things domestically, there was a survey that came out, I want to say about a week ago, that showed that 2/3 of young Americans, that was between 18 and 39 years old, didn't know that 6 million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust. And another 23% thought that the Holocaust was a myth or exaggerated. And I think this data raises really troubling questions about how our society is prioritizing human rights and democracy. How do we respond to knowledge gaps like this and strengthen various educational or family or community institutions that should be addressing these topics?
It's a great question, Chris. I read that same report and was so deeply troubled because it is only by remembering and learning about such tremendous atrocities that we can ensure that they do not happen again, and that we can really judge the importance of democratic values, democratic restraint on government behavior, that we can then recognize the importance of democracy, and most importantly, the importance of protecting the lives of individual people, regardless of their background. I think that starts with education. Education is central, and that is learning about history, both American history as well as global history, learning civics, and learning the importance of governmental structure, and ensuring that our educational system is infused with democratic values. Because as we look around the world where we see atrocities like the Holocaust and what we're seeing in other countries where there is systematic abuse of people, we see a lack of protection of human rights. And it is only in democracies that we see that those rights are fully protected. And when I say democracy, I mean democracies that are functioning with full accountability on the governing structure, where people's voices are regularly heard. And so we see around the country a lot of great projects in our civil society, as well as great educational efforts within our schools to raise awareness, to ensure that we have history, civics, and government taught in our schools. And we have to continue to consider this a priority, not just for the inherent value of those subjects in our educational system and in our civic society, but also as a means to promoting a stronger democracy that will serve all in our country.
Nicole, thank you very much for your thoughts on these topics. If anyone out there would like to learn more about what Nicole's been writing in the Choose Freedom Report, go to www.bushcenter.org and check it out. Thanks again, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you for all the Bush Center is doing.